All right. So it is May 18th. It's 1 p.m. and I'm interviewing Rob Gould. And let's just jump right in.
Okay.
So, Rob, can you tell me a little bit about yourself from sort of your early years?
My early years.
Yeah, regarding maybe peace activism, kind of just laying out the context.
Oh, okay. So I guess my entry into activism uh, probably began in elementary school because my father said it would be a good idea for me to go to Shattuck Elementary School, which is now Shattuck Hall on campus. You can see I'm very, very local. And so that was the whole campus around the neighborhood was a very low income, multicultural neighborhood. And so my father wanted me to have that experience of diversity. And of course, that was the early 1950s. But there was an interesting spirit in the United States in the early 1950s coming out of World War II. A lot of veterans were pretty disillusioned by the sort of impending empire that the United States was creating, and just a whole massive destruction that was a part of World War II was very sobering, I think, for a lot of people. Um, so anyway, so I think that I kind of got that in my system. My father was the air raid director for the what is now OHSU. And he came to the understanding that actually, taking shelter or the air raid shelter movement was absurd because no one would survive in an air raid shelter, and so he resigned that position. So that kind of my eyebrows went up around that. The '60s, of course, led to civil rights and the Vietnam War, and eventually the Cold War. So all three of those things had a big impact on me. So I would say that by the time I came to Portland State in 1966, I was already feeling fairly political, but the thing that was hanging over my head was the draft. And so a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, and I took a term off at Portland State and just read everything we could get our hands on about the Vietnam. And we soon realized that the mainstream media at that point was against the war. And so we're kind of going like, the mainstream media is against the war and we're still being drafted into that. So I think, that made a big difference in my sort of joining the resistance around that. And my friend and I were both lettermen at Portland State. We both played football. And so we took our letterman jackets down to the induction center where people were being drafted downtown. And we got there, early in the morning to greet the people who were coming to be inducted or to have physicals. And we handed them literature about the war was wrong and that there's things they could do to resist it. So that was fun. So I think, that led to, my doing draft counseling, which then morphed into draft military and veterans counseling. And that was in the Koinonia House, which is now the campus police station. And so I did that for several years. And again, we're working with people who are faced with the draft, trying to get them deferments and explaining how people were resisting going to Canada. We also were trying to get people out of the military who wanted to get out of the military. And a lot of veterans got less than honorable discharges for their anti-war work within the military. So we wanted to help them get their discharges upgraded. So we had the support of the campus ministers, and we lived on next to nothing because it was pretty hard to make money. We couldn't actually charge the people who came there for counseling because of our nonprofit status kind of wouldn't allow it at that point. So anyway, so that kind of got to go on. I went from there and I worked with the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quaker organization, on various peace and justice projects. And the third thing was to help start this program in conflict resolution.
Wow. So you got started early from elementary school up into your early 20s. You were really working with a lot of different people. I'm wondering, was there some pushback when you were visiting with the draft?
Pushback from where now?
From possibly just the draftees themselves when you were handing out literature?
Oh, that little drama. They were all sleepy, and I don't think they know quite what to make of it, especially since we had our letterman jackets on. We weren't coming across like typical anti-war people at that time. The sergeant who was sort of running the show at the top of the steps, there was a long flight of steps after going through the doors, and so he put out a garbage can, and so he, as we were handing it out, this literature out to people, he was saying, "You have to put it in the garbage can now." So, well, before he did that, I think we got some, some sympathy from the people coming into there. But it was hard to say. It was more of a symbolic statement than it was very practical, I think.
Yeah. Wow. So you were talking about how you were working as a nonprofit. I'm wondering, from the Vietnam War to the Cold War, in what sort of space did you really start to work with the Oregon Peace Institute and get into conflict resolution? How did you sort of have that shift?
Um, well, I've been interested in a lot of social change organizations, and so, I would kind of invent them periodically. Most of them just sort of, died on the vine. We had a Middle East Research Institute for a while, inviting both Jews and Palestinians to work together. Well, they didn't work together very well. The whole topic of Zionism just kind of split that organization in half. So that didn't really get off the ground. There was a neighbor care organization where we actually got a health clinic, a free health clinic started. And what's interesting about that is the woman who was the director and the main organizer was Steven Spielberg's cousin. Anya Spielberg is her name. And so she said, to get some funding, I'm going to see my cousin, down at a little family get together. I guess it was one summer. And so then she came back and reported to us that she asked Stephen, would he give some seed money for this neighbor care program? And he says, "Oh no, I never give money to charity at all." And it wasn't really until he made Schindler's List did he start giving money to charity. So it's interesting. And he has given a lot, so he gets a lot of credit. But so I started, kind of was in the formative stages to a number of different organizations, and again, a couple of successes and mostly failures. But what I finally at one point, Elizabeth First, former Congresswoman Elizabeth First, and I were both working with American Friends Service Committee at the same time. She was working out of the Seattle office, and I was, working at the Portland office. And so we got to be friends by going to some meetings, and so we were sort of cooked up this idea of the Oregon Peace Institute. She had moved it back, down to Portland, and so we were living in the same town. And so that's sort of how that got started. Now, in all fairness, Elizabeth is an amazingly charismatic person. And so she immediately attracted a lot of people's interest in this. And she was the director, and she got it going. I was kind of responsible for some of the educational aspects of the Institute. And she created this store in what used to be the Galleria, which was the first peace store in the United States, actually in a kind of a mini mall. But so she did a lot of stuff, including, organizing a huge demonstration at the, whole big festival in the park at the end of the Cold War. So she gets all the credit for all that. And I was going to do some educational aspects of it. And I thought, well, I, at that point, hadn't even finished, I barely maybe finished my undergraduate program. It took me 20 years, 66 to 86. And so I guess, yeah, it was actually, I hadn't even finished my undergraduate program. So I thought maybe I should get a degree if I'm going to be responsible for my education. So then I got 3 degrees quickly. That degree in philosophy at Portland State, then a master's degree in teaching at Lewis and Clark, and then a PhD in philosophy from the University of Oregon. So during that time, I was, especially when I was in Eugene, I was barely connected to the Oregon Peace Institute. But after I came back to Portland to teach in the philosophy department at Portland State, then I kind of helped revive that organization a little bit. Elizabeth was off in Congress at that point, and so her leadership was missing. And it was a pretty big void to try to fill. And we kind of went on, we sort of kept the organization alive, barely with a heartbeat. But then we decided that, and particularly, I guess when I was in Eugene, I was working with Cheney Ryan, who was a philosophy professor at U of O, and then Leslie Scott, who actually was a long time director of the what's that festival? Soul hippie festival down there. Slipping my mind.
Country Fair.
Country Fair. There you go. The Country Fair. So the Country Fair. So the 3 of us kind of wanted to start some peace studies programs that were more significant than they had been at U of O. They have a peace studies minor. In fact, I staffed that for a while when I was down there. But we wanted to get actual, curriculum, the expanded curriculum. So when I came to Portland State, I, started working with Mel Gertoff. And I think I told you my story last time when I called him up from the U of O and said, yeah, I'm coming to Portland State to teach a class, and I wonder if we can start some programming in conflict resolution and peace studies. And he said, who are you? So I had to actually meet him face to face before he realized, oh, well, maybe this guy is serious enough to work with. And so we formed this organization, which eventually we named Catalyst, which then again helped design the graduate program in conflict resolution.
So to just go back a little bit, the minor program at U of O, that was established before
Yes.
Oregon Peace Institute and Catalyst?
Yes, and again, I think the context here is important. That during the 80s, the 1980s, there was a lot of academic response to the Cold War. So you had peace studies programs, literally all over the country, and so the U of O had one. So did OSU. They still have one. But there were a lot of minor programs in particular, but they were different kinds, sometimes undergraduate and a few graduate programs. Graduate programs were a little harder to come by. So those existed, and actually it was odd that Portland State didn't have that. And the efforts, to start something like that were met with a lot of resistance. Now, any academic community is going to have a spectrum of sort of beliefs around activism and change, sort of the theory of change here. But no matter what the theory of change is amongst the faculty, it's basically the administration that makes a lot of decisions. They either make things happen or they don't make things happen. And my experience as a draft counselor, we actually got the student union to vote to give us maybe $5 per Portland State student that we counseled. But the president of the university, overruled that, right? Wouldn't let them do it. And the president, of course, of the university continues to have that kind of power. As you may know, that the faculty senate, voted to not allow guns on campus and not allow the campus police to carry weapons that could kill people. And yet the president, just overruled that and said it would happen. So no matter what the theory of change might be amongst faculty, the administration really controls how things happen. But when I came to Portland State, Judith Ramaley was the president, and she's still working on campus here. And she's a Quaker, and she was very much encouraging people to help this to happen. So we sort of had some administrative support. The dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Marvin Kaiser, was very progressive himself and was very interested and very supportive. So the theory of change is you have to have things line up all the way through administration for it to actually happen. And we just sort of lucked out. Mel Gertov and some other faculty had a survey on campus before I came up from Eugene, where there was a lot of interest, amongst faculty for having some kind of peace studies program. So again, when I arrived and we started the small group, which became Catalyst, we had a lot of support, of faculty. We had, support of the administration. So we were in a very good place to be able to start something in peace studies and conflict resolution. But the word peace had to be taken out of the proposal, as I may have told you before, because the Gulf War at that point was being, championed by people who said that people who were against it or for peace were not supporting the troops. And so the legislature in Salem, the people who were in the know said that a proposal with the word peace in it would never fly through the legislature. So that had to be taken out. But we've essentially been a peace and conflict resolution program the whole time. This kind of the peace part should have been more stealth. And, I think people are happy it's there. But we just, for, again, getting it through and approved, you have to do some little tweaks.
So it was mostly political to take out the word peace and just.
It was 100% political.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think I'll just as a little sidebar. For me, conflict resolution is distinctive because we focus on conflict, and conflict wherever it happens, whether it's in your head or between people or in big groups or nations. We focus on conflict and the dynamics of conflict and, try to resolve that conflict for peace and justice. So obviously, no peace without justice. So we believe in that as well. So again, you'll find other disciplines, sociology particularly is interested in social conflict, psychology is interested in, psychological conflict, but we're interested in conflict, wherever it comes from. We're less interested in social structures, that sociology is interested in. We're less interested in a lot of psychological pathologies that psychology is interested in. But we really are a distinctive academic area. So you can see that peace and justice and conflict is all sort of focuses in on, well, how can we work with the conflict here? How can we help move it along in a positive direction? So it's not only just about the mechanics of conflict, it's also the sensibility that we can live a better world. We can live a more moral world. It can create a moral world if we find out how to engage in conflict with less violence, with less fury, with less, anger. Anger's a good thing, but when it becomes abusive, then conflicts really become harmful. We want to take the harm and the suffering out of conflict. So that's who we are. That's my sidebar on what we essentially do.
that was the spirit in which that you kind of structured your program. You feel that has that survived to now?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I should run it by the faculty and see if they still think that would be the best way of describing things. You never know. But, there is, you take any 5 academics and put them in a room and try to get them to agree on anything, you're going to have, a job on your hands. But it would be an interesting conversation in any case.
Yeah. So I want to shift back a little bit. You said that you were kind of looked out. You were in this moment where the administration was sort of prime for you to really push this program through, and that you had done a survey that the faculty wanted this program.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how did Catalyst fit in terms of like pushing the CR program? Who was making that up? Was that solely faculty? Were you getting people from the community, students to be involved?
The actual, because there was a sort of it was a kind of a project of the Oregon Peace Institute, as well as, you know, a project of the faculty of Portland State. So the final document that was approved by the legislature has the two organizations as co-sponsors. So in some ways, we're written into, you know, Oregon Peace Institute is written into the document for the you know, the whole graduate program and conflict resolution. So there was that, and therefore Catalyst had members of the community who were associated with OPI on it. So there was that kind of partnership from the very beginning, and of course OPI is still associated with our program. We've had a couple of other nonprofits over time that were also associated with our program, but that was sort of the founding organization. So it's nice to have that kind of connection with the community, I think. It means that we're responsible not just to the university, but we're responsible to the community as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great thing to have for your program, to have that structure there. In terms of students, though, how was the student body receiving the CR program? Was there sort of an atmosphere with, I know that there were a lot of protests going on during the 90s regarding the Gulf War. Did you feel that that sort of changed how students were being receptive to conflict resolution?
Well, this kind of happened in the, you know, in the tail end of the Gulf War. But yeah, I think that there certainly was a lot of interest. We had a community meeting both in Eugene and in Portland, because I was trying to start a graduate program in both the University of Oregon and Portland State at the same time. And so, you know, put a lot of miles between, you know, on my little Volkswagen bus. But so these community meetings, basically, we're trying to get an assessment of just how enthusiastic people were who were potential students. And so we had very successful community meetings at both ends. We were able to actually start a graduate program earlier at the University of Oregon because they had an interdisciplinary graduate studies program out of their graduate office. And so we could actually just slip into that. And so that went for a little over a year with a dozen students. And so I would go down and teach classes in that and make sure they were supervised for their practicums. And so they would take other classes at the U of O. So that actually happened before the graduate program was approved at Portland State, because we had to go through a lot more bureaucratic processes at Portland State, because it was going to be an entity in its own as a graduate program. So, but yes, we had a very successful community meeting at Portland State, and really the only person who came who was opposed to it was the director of a very large mediation organization at that point. And they were trying to figure out how to navigate the nonprofit world. They've been a public agency, and I think they were nervous that we were going to be credentialing people without being tied much to the mediation community at that point. My co-founder, Mary Zinkin, has been a long-time mediator and very connected to the mediation community, but that particular director was a little skeptical that we had the credibility to produce a graduate degree. Everyone else thought we were, and eventually we won her over, and she ended up hiring our students. She was just worried that our young students were going to come in and take jobs away from other people who were doing the same work without a graduate degree. But people really wanted a graduate degree. I mean, a lot of students. We took had a pretty big mailing list of potential students, and people agreed that the graduate degree was what they wanted, because most of them already had undergraduate degrees. So the first group of people, first couple years, we were dealing with students pretty old. I mean, they were in their 40s and sometimes 50s.
And this argument about credentials, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, there, yeah, there used to be for a long time in that period there was a governing agency that would credential people with for mediation in any case, and so but all you really had to have was a 40-hour training for that particular credential to be able to be a mediator. So, and that agency actually got defunded, after a while. So it doesn't exist anymore. So there's no government body which is sort of credentialing. So actually, right now we're in a place where uh, people have a general agreement that the entry level mediator should have at least a 40-hour training. But we felt that people needed more education. I mean, it's, conflict resolution is not just mediation. It's, facilitation, it's negotiation, it's all these peace processes, it's restorative justice. It goes in a lot of different directions. So it needed something that was more sophisticated.
Okay. So just to ask a question, how did the CR program in U of O last as long as the CR program in Portland
So
State?
if I wasn't down there running it, which I eventually had to put more of my energies at Portland State, I was living in Portland. And so I just kind of, yeah, my priorities sort of switched, because just because of the need here in Portland to really ramp this thing up. It was going to take a lot of work. So I personally just had to let that go. And then when I let it go, nobody else took it up. So it disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we had some great students. I still keep in touch with one of the students down there, and from that program during that
Was that
particular time.
during the 90s or the 2000s that it sort of dissolved?
Well, yeah. So I probably taught. Let's see. I wonder. I probably taught in that. Look at my little CV here. Um, I came up here in 1992 from Eugene to teach a class, and then started working on this. So I'm not sure exactly what year that was. Um, should be on my CV. It's not even there. That's embarrassing. Uh, so, so yeah, it was when it was the early 90s. It was probably 94, 95, somewhere in there. That was the time when we had that one going. I'd have to really check on that though.
It was sort of the beginning of when the PSU CR program is really taking off was the mid 90s, I remember. And so having this shift to where you were focusing on PSU centrally, were there a lot of difficulties that made you shift to focus on PSU in terms of like running the program, establishing it?
Um, yeah, well, uh, as I said before, you have a spectrum of people, academics. Now, it was an interesting change in the 1960s. Before the 1960s, higher education was pretty split between liberals and conservatives. But after the 60s, or even during the 60s, it was really a sea change where most universities were dominated by liberal professors. So that kind of the balance turned into an imbalance in some people's minds, but to me, it just sort of reflects the change that we call the cultural wars. And there's always been dissent, all the way back to the priest who was on board with Christopher Columbus and was outraged about what how brutal he could be with the natives. And so there's been a long history of dissent in this country, but dissent hasn't become a major force in politics until the 50s and into the 60s, particularly in the 60s. And so you find that getting right into mainstream politics. The Democrats get pushed farther and farther to the left, and so there's really a culture war. And the culture war simply is that we stop being an unquestioned white supremacist country. We stop, being just mindlessly imperialist with the rest of the world. That people really, there's enough of a movement to question the empire the United States has become, and to question the white supremacy and the sexism and the homophobia and on and on. So all of this diversity and inclusivity is really a product of the 60s and 70s. And so you have on campus, again, liberal professors, and then you have radical professors, so you have kind of the liberals are kind of more traditional, and they're sort of a little happy with male supremacy, etc., white supremacy. They feel like it's always been that way. There was one professor at Portland State, who will go unnamed, who I really liked a lot, but he said that a woman could never write a great novel. He lost his job for that, actually, because he stuck to that so much. They finally fired him, full professor. But, so you have vestiges of conservatism, even among the liberals. But then you have the very left-wing radicals as well. So, so that's the climate that we're in. And then there's conservatives just in terms of structure and status. I was an adjunct professor, and I was starting. Basically, I was the core person, the key director who was making this stuff happen. Some people thought that's great, he's adjunct, but he's clearly capable of doing this stuff, and more power. We need this kind of thing. They really welcomed and admired, the fact that I was stubborn enough to make this thing happen. But there were conservative people, more conservative side, or more traditionalists, I guess. They go, what the hell, he's not a tenure line person. He's not a full professor. He's not even on the tenure track at all. He's just an adjunct, running a graduate program, So there was a lot of pushback from all levels of administration and faculty about me being in the leadership of this. And also with the way we were structured, it was without tenure lines and on self-support. So we had to raise all of our own, money for all of our expenses. So to pay our faculty, we had to raise it in tuition. So luckily, so many students were interested in this. We filled up our classes so well that, 10 years ago, we had up to 14 adjuncts working with us, with our core faculty, and we were able to, get our core faculty up to 6, 7 positions, and now we have 8. And so we grew very fast under that model. So that created resentment too. Why? Not only is this guy not a tenure line, they don't even have tenure lines. That's a threat to tenure. At least it was in some people's minds, a threat to tenure and academic freedom. Although, that's kind of, academic freedom is not really an issue because you can't fire a person for what they say in their classroom unless it's, extremely outrageous. So, but in any case, we got pushed back from a number of different angles. The self-support thing was a threat too, because departments didn't want to feel like they had to raise their own money for pay their faculty. But we more and more moved to that model anyway, where student credit hours is very, very seriously part of the budget. So in any case, yeah, we had resistance, and I don't blame the resistance. We were we're oddball. We were trying to take a square peg and pound it into a round hole, and we kept on chipping away until that little triangle would fit in there, and it was quite an experience, I have to say. It's kind of amazing that it worked as well as it has.
Wow. Just hearing it, how you got from that point to this point now, it's really an amazing story. In terms of selecting the faculty, I know that you kind of mentioned a little bit about the interdisciplinary nature of the graduate program in U of O, and then you're talking about trying to fit, a square peg in a circle hole here. How did that work out for you, sort of creating this from the ground up with that opposition and just trying to create a syllabus for this?
Well, I think it's kind of hit and miss. It would have been nice to actually have a mentor, somebody who had been a chair, of another department, particularly in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. It would have been nice to have somebody, that I could have met with saying, okay, this is how you build a program. This is how you build a department. This is all the things you have to, keep in mind. And these are kind of how you set priorities, and, here's how you, hire people, all these basic questions. It would have been, like I said, it would have been nice to have a mentor. Marvin Kaiser tried to do the best he could, actually, but he was not a department chair, and he was building the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences across a whole lot of disciplines. There was a lot of growth during the time that he was dean, and so he had his hands full, really. And he started taking me. I used to try to get to meet with him every week, and then he said, "Now, how about every 2 weeks? Now, how about just once a month?" So I really didn't have a lot of guidance. So I had to kind of invent it, and we were also, I mean, the other aspect of it is that I think that the group of people that I got together, were pretty much on the left side of the political spectrum, maybe way left. And so we were kind of collectivists in a way. We sort of thought that things should be pretty equal. And the first budget that I created for the program had everybody paid the same, including the office coordinator. We were all paid the same. Wow. And so, Marvin Kaiser looked at my budget and says, "What are you doing? You can't pay your office coordinator the same as your faculty." "Yeah, well, we've got the money. I'd like to split it evenly." And he just kind of laughed me out of the office, right? But so with some things we just couldn't do. Although actually we got our first office coordinator paid more than most, office coordinators, unfortunately, more than our current office coordinator. But it was spectacularly good. In any case, it was. It made for kind of an island in our program. And I think people felt like we were doing something unique and special in a lot of different ways. But back to a theory of change. If you try to change too much, then you get too much resistance, right? So we had to always kind of moderate, the amount of change, just to manage, the resistance we might get from it. So it just had to follow a path that was taking some risk, but kind of, being pretty sensible about the extent of the risks. But we were all kind of risk takers at that point. I still can't believe that I had the energy to welcome in the first cohort and tell them that I was a replacement faculty, sabbatical replacement faculty in the philosophy department at Lewis and Clark. I look back and I go, I had a lot of energy then. I wish I had some of that energy now.
Wow. So, knowing that the first students that you were admitting into this new program were older, and you had a large, I'm assuming, entry class, did that stabilize, or did you see that kind of go down a little bit, or were there like bumps and waves in terms of attendance for your program?
Well, actually, we had about a dozen people on the first cohort, and I think we had around a dozen the second year too. So that was a nice manageable size. And of course, at that point, we really just had two faculty members, Barry Sig and myself. And so she taught them mediation-related courses, and she was at 0.5, and I was a full-time, and I basically taught the rest of the courses. So we had a pretty small budget, and it was pretty workable with a dozen students, right? It was very cozy. We have fond memories from that time when it was sort of like, a very small liberal arts college somewhere. But like Lewis and Clark. In any case, in order to hire more faculty and to get more diversity, in terms of what we could do and the different parts of conflict resolution and peace studies, then we had to attract more students, and that was pretty easy. We just offered more courses slowly, and more people came, and then that built up more money, and then we could hire more people. So then, over the next maybe 5 years, we grew and grew and grew until we were admitting about 45 students a year. Now that was ridiculous. We really overdid it, in a way, for fairly small faculty have that many graduate students. And the chumminess of the program kind of got lost too. We used to have these potlucks, during the year with all the students and faculty. But boy, when it got to be 45 students, we could hardly get 4 or 5 people together in a meeting because they didn't know each other very well. So we realized that was a mistake to get that big that fast. And so things sort of leveled off after a while in a more reasonable amount. And of course, the whole graduate tuition disaster that we have now was kind of beginning to loom. The tuition was going up and up and up and up, even at Portland State, and we had to do it in order to meet the budget. So we've had all kinds of drivers on this graduate student or just any student tuition crisis. So that kicked in more and more, and then graduate programs started disappearing in all fields across the country because they couldn't attract enough students, they couldn't pay their bills, so they had to close their shops. Law schools closed down. So with that, we had the shrinking effect on the graduate population. So now, over time we got small again, but we formed an undergraduate program, and I have an undergraduate major, minor. We got a proposal for a certificate in, and of course the graduate program is overhauled so that it looks different, and we have two certificates too, which are just we can get in a year. So we've kind of changed what we're offering to fit what students need and what students can afford.
And what year did these changes take place in?
It's been over time. I don't know. It kind of evolved more than it happened. We should have actually a timeline of every year. What were the highlights of that? But again, even though I have a history degree, I love history. I read history. It's fascinating stuff. But because of all this, we've sort of been on emergency mode the whole time. And the previous office coordinator, Stephanie Janke, we had a every Monday, this is a Monday, so if every Monday the two of us would get together first thing in the morning, we talk about what's the crisis of the day, and so we go through the week with a new crisis every day. So with all that sort of crisis mentality, with all the problems, et cetera, that we've had to deal with, it's a little harder keeping the files, in a decent order, and that's why, unfortunately, the whole history of the project is just in the boxes, right? It's just sort of thrown in boxes. I made a few manuals, that have some sequences in it, which, I'm respectable enough, but most of it is just kind of lost in big piles of paper. So this is what's exciting about this history project, because we really need people to look at this, and try to even tell us what our own history is, because it's hard for us to know, other than the drama of the whole thing. It's hard for us to know year by year what happened. That's my excuse.
Yeah, that is definitely a highlight point for us, I think, as historians, is figuring out that timeline and going through those boxes. So you're in luck there.
Well, if I had the time, I would do it. I have actually over the way, every once in a while, I would actually go through a box, and I would find that like 90% of the stuff is just, recycling immediately. And maybe 5% of the 10% that's left is questionable, but I'm not an archivist, so I don't know exactly what things to say. So probably.
No shredding allowed, Rob.
Pardon me?
No shredding allowed.
Yeah, I don't know shredding allowed.
Not till later, not so much.
Yeah. But anyway, I did a little bit of it. I can just guarantee you that you'll probably find that 90% is like, why did you save this?
No, I'll tip my hand if I could jump in here. I processed 2 boxes, and that is not at all what I found. What I found is what one always finds in institutional records is duplicates.
Oh,
that's the only thing that I would remind you. The other thing, that there are some things in what we're going to call the archive that won't make it to the PSU library because it wouldn't make it from any department. You can't have any, there's certain rules at the state level that regulate, you can't have anything that has a person's social security number on it.
Oh, right,
You
right.
can't have certain student information and files. So, au contraire, believe you me, I've seen my share of these, as have many of the students in this class. And it's very typical. What you've saved is great. And very, in terms of its condition, very typical and nothing to be embarrassed
You
about.
wouldn't be embarrassed about this?
Not at all. Now
Okay.
it's 1:45, so I just want to make sure Alex has a chance to open up for other questions
Okay.
from the students, and then we'll start to wind down.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. If anybody has anything that they want to ask, right now would be a wonderful moment. You can turn your video on, or
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to chime in.
Hi, I have a question. I just would ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the partnership between PSU and U of O. And kind of what was that collaboration like?
Right.
And, you know, what were some of the challenges involved in that?
Right. Well, you know, I stayed in touch with U of O, and Jane Gordon, who is now the vice provost in charge of the Portland Center of the U of O. She was the director of the law school down at the U of O, and eventually their graduate program in conflict resolution got started, really, or restarted in the law school. And it's a wonderful program. It combines you know, a law school education with a conflict resolution. You can get a master's degree in dispute resolution, I think that's what they call it down there, and you know, and a law degree at the same time. And so you can be equipped to either go adversarial or go into the conflict resolution mode, which a lot of decisions, a lot of cases get mediated. So it's a great program. They patterned their program after ours. They had a similar array of classes. They just kind of duplicated what we had done. So that was a kind of a compliment in itself. So the program really did evolve in a great direction down there. And I'm really happy that that happened. We had an organization, the Northwest Institute for Conflict Resolution, which sort of married the two programs together for some common projects, so that we kept that going as well. We were asked by our funder, one of our major funders is Al Jubitz from the Jubitz Truck Stop, you know, heritage. His father started the Jubitz Truck Stop, and he created a big empire of his own, a dial-a-truck business, you know, kind of computerized way of getting trucks hooked up with loads. So he is a very liberal Rotarian. And so there's a Rotarian peace organization and world peace organization that the Rotarians run. And so, and there's campuses which become Rotary Peace Centers. And so Al said, why don't you try to do that? And I said, yeah, let's do that. I thought, let's do it in conjunction with the U of O. And so, so they were excited to do that down there. The director of that program, Tim Hicks, and I formed this, you know, big proposal. They had a lot of staff down there who did a lot of the assembly of parts, and so they certainly did their share. And so we submitted it and didn't get it. So it was a lot of work to try to get it. And in the process of doing that, the Portland State, actually, even Marvin Kaiser, the Portland State, and there were some faculty members involved who were very angry that we were collaborating with the U of O. That, you know, there's this competition between Portland State and the U of O. You know, it's gone on forever. There's competition between pretty much every university and every other university. So it's a very competitive atmosphere. And so the idea that we were collaborating with them, and the Portland State could have done that proposal all by themselves. We had sufficient resources to make a good proposal. And I disagreed, you know, and so I really got sideways with, you know, with faculty, some faculty in the administration. And it got a little angry, I got to say. But and then when afterwards, and we didn't get the proposal, then they kind of said, "Well, it just shows you made a stupid mistake." Well, then Al came and met with Tim Hicks and myself and said, "Listen, I really appreciate how strong a proposal you gave. So I'm gonna give each one of you $500,000." I thought, well, that's not a bad consolation prize. And we needed another faculty member in order to have enough faculty to have an undergraduate program. So that, so if we had to, I'll be blunt with you, if we didn't have a vital undergraduate program, we probably wouldn't exist today, because most of our students are undergraduates, and it's a great program, I think. And Tom Hastings really designed a good program. So yeah, so this collaboration thing is an interesting point, because it can be, and people who try to collaborate with U of O on other things will use us as an example of saying, well, we've done this before.
Thank you so much for that awesome answer.
It's a funny story anyway.
Did anybody else have a question to ask or something? No?
Maybe if I could just chime in, just first of all, to thank you, Rob, and thank you, Alex, for it's a gift to hear this story roll out in its fullness. It's just wonderful. But I was very intrigued when Rob mentioned that you somehow got the student government to give the early CR, like enabling committee, some dollars, and then you got pushed down by the administration. Take me back to that story, because I know the students do not let go of money easily.
Well,
and of course, that's also where veterans' voices might be quite official and prominent in the student government.
Yeah.
And if you could just tell that just a little bit more detail, be great.
Yeah, I've got the Vanguard News article about that with me with hair down to here. But that was mid 1970s, early to mid 1970s that happened.
We have to see that picture.
We have to. That is a must.
And that article.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. We're so deprived of our documents, Rob. It's like you have these, people who need their fix from their documents. But please tell the story.
It's great. Well, I kind of tell the story in that article. So that was sort of fun. But anyway, yeah, at that point, the president overruled the students, and they had made a full decision to pay us per counselee, and it got overruled. So yeah, I hopefully they've learned. I assume they've learned a lesson. The students are not going to let go of their money that easily anymore. But again, I just want to emphasize that the politics was not conducive. Now, since this is the anniversary of the May Day demonstrations at Portland State, and every year this rolls around, and particularly the important anniversary dates, that we have to remember that Portland State was like the Kent State shootings. It was a very violent confrontation between the police and students, and so the administration wasn't really even very behind the students at that point. So it's again, I guess when you talk about the theory of change, you have to really talk about narrative, and I think that that's where history is the best. History really can tap into the narrative of the times, and that there's narratives and there's counter narratives, and the narratives that Portland State was kind of the underdog, and they wanted to kind of bend over backwards to be more traditional, because they felt like they couldn't. The early days that they were just trying to have any credibility at all.
Right.
So that's the sympathetic view of that particular narrative. But with the narratives of the 60s, you can see how those things would collide. That's a very interesting story in itself.
Wow. All right, Alex.
I think it's especially interesting to see how it's being written in the PSU magazine, like in contrast to what you're saying. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
Well, I was looking at it again too, and it skates completely over any sense of that depth of engagement with the time, and much more can we rush to think of the good things that came out of it, which is fine. That's not a sin. That is not, you know, nothing wrong with that. But very, very interesting. Very interesting, you know, how these narratives become how these events, which are complicated and messy, become a story.
Yeah. And again, back to the culture war, which I'm pushing because I'm teaching a class on that soon. But, you know, the culture war is a war of narratives. And so, you know, if you have the dominant narrative for a long time, the counter narrative is small, people don't notice the counter narrative. I mean, you know, Greenwich Village has been an alternative community for 400 years, right? But, you know, the message didn't get out to the rest of the United States until it snuck out, you know, over time. So, you know, again, the 60s and 70s are a time when the counter narrative really gets to be threatening to the narrative, traditional narrative, and we're still living that whole epoch.
It's powerful. You want to close us for the day, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming here and taking the time to talk with us, Rob. Was there anything that you wanted to share with us or tell us before I close us out and end the recording?
No, I'm sure I'll think of 5 things as soon as the recording stops, right? That's just the way that's going to go. Because there's so many things. I mean, what's fun about this for me is that there's so much percolates when people are interested. You know, it just stimulates that. And of course, you know, I think, you know, memories are so important because I think they can inform aspects of the present that you kind of forget about, or you don't realize what power and what longevity some of the things going on now, and deep roots that things are happening now. So it's always a great experience to have people interested in hearing these stories, and they're just fun to tell too, because they were amusing to live through. You can laugh about some of the stuff that you cried through before.
Amazing. All right.
Thank you again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to end the recording now.